All right, so now that we have our image quality settings dialed in, I'm going to introduce to you the concept of dynamic range. And you may have heard me mention it a bit earlier when we talked about camera bodies, but now I'm gonna go into significant detail about it. I'm gonna go over what it is and then a few tools that you can use to measure your dynamic range when you're out in the field shooting. So with that being said, let's start from the top. What is dynamic range? So dynamic range is essentially the range that your camera can capture details in a scene. More particularly, how much detail can it capture in the shadows and how much detail can it capture in the highlights. So a camera with good dynamic range can pull out more details in the shadows and in more low light situations well. It can also help preserve the highlights correctly. A camera with a low dynamic range, such as a cell phone or anything with a low sensor, is not going to be able to capture details in the darker spots and the brighter spots of the image. What is going to happen is a term we like to call clipping. So generally, clipping means that a part of an image either has pure white or pure black in it. Generally, you want to avoid any image that has pure white or pure black in it, mainly because it looks unprofessional. However, there are a few instances where it's going to be mandatory and you won't be able to avoid this. And there also are a few instances where you may want to incorporate pure whites and pure blacks for artistic reasons. Here's an example of an image where the highlights are blown out. As you can see in the sky there, it's pure white. There's no detail, there's no color range, there's no kind of white, there's no moodiness. It's just pure white. So that's an example of blowing out your highlights. Here's an example of an image where the shadows are blown out. So as you can see in the darker spots of the image, it is pure black. And the interesting thing about blown out highlights and shadows is that your eye generally wants to go to those spots because black and white are significant colors. So when you see those on an image, it pulls the eye to that spot. And generally, you're not aiming to pull the eye to those particular parts of the image unless you're doing it very intentionally. So, as I said before, you want to try your best to avoid clipping any of your highlights or shadows. However, there are a few artistic reasons why you might want to do this and some places where you actually can't avoid this. For example, if you're shooting directly into the sun, so if you have the actual sun in your image, the small part where the sun is most likely going to be blown out, and there's really no way to avoid that at all. However, you can figure out how to expose your camera in a certain way so that everything around the sun isn't blown out. And I'm going to go through this in the exposure video when we're going to talk about the tools you can use to adjust your exposure correctly. For now, we're just going and talking about dynamic range and how to see it and how to spot it and how to measure it. So another reason that you might want to artistically blow out your skies is during portraits. So there's a portrait style that's fairly popular right now where you shoot directly into the sun, you have a flash lighting up your face, and you have a blown out sky behind them to help create a negative space where the eye isn't going to want to go there because you want to focus on the person. So people are okay with a pure white background in some instances for artistic portrait shots. But as I said before, in general, you want to avoid this. Another, on the opposite side of the spectrum, darks. There can be a few more artistic reasons, in my opinion, for why you'd want to clip your shadows. And for the example, that could be for shots like this, where you're trying to minimize everything in the background and focus on a particular subject. Then you could darken out everything and clip everything else just to emphasize that particular subject. But I don't shoot this kind of work a lot, and when I do, it's usually fairly intentional, so I know what I'm getting into. But if you're shooting a landscape, for example, and there's a part that's darkened out, for example, in this photo right here, you can see this area in the bottom corner here is black. Generally, you wouldn't want that to be black. You can minimize the amount of detail in that area and the light in that area, but generally you want as much detail as possible so that the eye can absorb as much as it can and make that scene much more realistic and beautiful to the eye. So with that being said, don't clip your highlights, don't clip your shadows, unless you're doing it very artistically for a very particular reason. All right, so now let's talk about the two tools that you might use to measure your dynamic range. And the first tool is called zebra stripes. So within your camera menu system, Some cameras allow you to have, and this is particularly for mirrorless cameras, where you can see the shot that you're going to shoot before you do it. They'll project zebra stripes on the screen over the image so you can see areas that are very close to being blown out. So this can help you prevent yourself from taking a shot before you even do it. So enabling zebra stripes on your camera through the menu system is a great way to mitigate this. The second tool that you can use for this is called the histogram, which is a little bit more complicated. And when you first look at this thing, like this is a histogram right here, it looks very complicated. And if I'm being 100% honest, for the first 2 years I did photography, I didn't even pay attention to this thing because I didn't even want to dive into it because it seemed too complicated. But it's actually extremely easy. So I'm going to go ahead and show you exactly how this thing works. So if you look at this graph on the horizontal axis, on the left side there is going to be the blacks, and on the right side there are going to be whites. On the vertical axis, it measures how many pixels are in a particular scene and how many are of the white or the black nature. So generally in the middle of the graph, that is where your midtones are, or gray pixels. And this whole thing is simply measured on luminosity or brightness from black to white. So if you see a graph like this, where there is more vertical pixels on the left side or the black side, you're going to have a fairly underexposed image, and it could mean that you are clipping parts of your shadows, so be careful. On the other side of the spectrum, if you see a histogram like this, that could mean that you are blowing out your highlights because there are more pixels on the white side. Generally, if the graph has a almost pyramid type of shape to it where there are more pixels in the midtones area, that generally means you have a fairly well exposed image. And no two image is ever gonna look like a pyramid exactly, and you're never gonna wanna strive for that exactly. But in general, you want as little pixels in the pure blacks and as little pixels in the pure whites as possible. And a lot of cameras actually have a setting where you could have a histogram visible on the screen. So this will allow you to see the histogram and what you're blowing out in either direction before you even take the photo. And this is extremely helpful. So I usually keep it up in the bottom left corner of my screen. Another great thing is this will appear in the Lightroom and the Photoshop when you are going to edit. So what does all this mean? Essentially, whenever you get a camera or you're working with a new camera, you want to figure out what your camera's dynamic range is by using all these tools and these techniques that I've gone over in this video. That way you can know what the limits of your camera are, and if you're going to need to do any particular tricks when it comes to exposing your image in order to make sure you are capturing everything in the correct range and everything is exposed correctly. In the next video, I'm going to go over the particular tools within your camera that you can use to make sure that you are exposing the image correctly. Let's go ahead and hop into that video.